الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الجزاء. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon as well in Istanbul. Really I'm honored, really, as I said, to be amongst you all, albeit virtually, inshallah in person soon. So today my topic, let me just try and share. I think I should be able to share the screen. I think everyone can see that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant.
Right. Expand the screen. Can you expand the screen?
Yeah,
that's better.
It's better. All right, brilliant. Okay, so my talk today is built around my second book, as was mentioned in the introduction, on the problem of evil. And it's a bit interesting because at the end of my book, having gone through a lot of philosophical sort of explanations and theological explanations as to why there'll be a permission of pain and suffering and evil in the world, I kind of concluded that I really think the philosophical approach of theodicy may be not the best approach to take. I'm not saying it's useful, and I'll go over it today, hopefully, and we can have a discussion about it. But we need a kind of different approach. So one approach that I intimated at the end of the book was something called compassion theodicy. It's not my term. It's a term by Bethany Solareda, who I'll mention as we go along. And I'll unpack this notion. So my topic today really is about this idea of compassion theodicy and how would the Muslim theodicist, the Muslim who is attempting to explain why evil exists in the world from an Islamic perspective, from the Aqidah of Islam, why they ought to take this approach rather than the current and prevalent philosophical approach. So this is how I envision the talk to go. I'll just sketch briefly what is the problem of evil. Then I'll take Hujjat al-Islam, Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's framing of it, which is, I think, it's almost as if he was living in the 21st century, the way he frames it. And very quickly, some responses Muslim theologians and philosophers, mutakallimun and falasifa, have given to the problem of evil. Then I'm going to move into compassionate theodicy, and then we'll break that down as to see what is it really, and whether it's something a Muslim theodicist should take up. Just to kickstart us off, I've got a bunch of snapshots here, pictures. What do you think I'm trying to do with this? I mean, what do you think? Let's try and identify what these pictures are, and then try and think why have I put this on the screen. So to my left, so if I was to look to my left, that might be to your right, I can see men in suits, and it looks like it was Chinese written on their suits, chemical suits. What do you think that picture's about?
It might be about an epidemic.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, it is. And you're right. It is about an epidemic, which is the COVID pandemic. So that's one.
It's a natural evil.
Okay, we'll come back to we'll come back to the classification. It's true, it is a natural evil. That's true. It wasn't through any human agency. Well, depends on whose theories you want to take. But yeah, a natural evil. What about the painting moving to the center? What do you think I'm trying to capture with that? Well, I didn't do it. I didn't do the painting, but I mean, on the slide, what does it look like? That kind of picture.
Like a man in pain, I mean.
Yeah, definitely. I try to look for just a very neutral picture of a person in pain. Yeah, it is a person in pain and suffering. That's true. Then moving slightly to my right, where we've now got a picture from one of the programs you may see in the National Geographic Channel, or maybe you've seen it with your own eyes. What do we think's going on here? What do we think's going on here?
Lion is breaking fasting.
Ah, yeah. Iftar time for the lioness. That's true. So iftar time for the lioness. Yeah. What might that be representing?
It is the nature of law. Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
the law of nature.
Yeah, that's right. So the animal kingdom, predation, animal hunting, brilliant.
He has to eat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he has to eat. That's right. There's no, we wouldn't normally say a lion, is morally wrong for, pouncing on that poor zebra, and is morally culpable. Yeah, so it's predation in nature. That's true. Then down to my right, immediately underneath the picture of that lioness, what do we think is going on here? What does that look like? Yeah, in case anyone's, it is the storming of Al-Aqsa Sharif, by the soldiers in that Zionist entity. And what I'm trying to categorize with that is evil on a systemic level. I have a paper going to be addressing that, the system problem of evil. So regimes that perpetuate evil and pain and suffering. And regime here, I don't just mean a government. Regimes can be certain power structures. So an abusive spouse who's trapped their spouse in a relationship and causes them misery and pain. That's a kind of regime of inflicting harm. Okay, and the final one to my left, underneath the picture of that COVID pandemic, what do you think is going on here?
A volcano erupted and destroyed the city?
That's right, yeah, it is a volcano that's erupted. Again, a natural evil. So I guess you get the picture. This slide was just trying to show the different types of evil, and then the kind of challenges a theodicist face, and how they try to give answers to all these different types of evil. Let me just go through some terms very quickly. Most of you will know, just in case some of our audience don't know. Here are some key terms. Evil is defined in many different ways, but generically evil could be something bad, a negative state of affairs, or the way things shouldn't be, i.e. ought not to be. So there's a way things ought to be, but evil is contrary to that. It's the way things ought not to be. And theodicy very generally is explaining how and why Allah Azza wa Jal, will permit suffering and pain in the world. What possible reasons could there be? Anti-theodicy, here I'm using it in two senses, and I'll explain that a bit further. The view that, it could mean the view that we shouldn't try and justify and give reasons why Allah may allow evil and suffering to exist. It's not our business to give a reason. Or it could be trying to give a reason, trying to give a theodicy is actually dangerous and harmful. Finally, compassionate theodicy, and I'll unpack this definition as we go, is a method of dealing with the problem of evil involving giving agency of decision making to the patient, to the person suffering evil or suffering pain, but by giving them theological resources, not definitive answers. So very quickly, those are the terms. I'm not going to play a video. I'm just going to pause it here. Basically, in Superman, there's a clip where Lex Luthor, berates Superman and says, he gets angry with Superman, and then they have a verbal bout. And then Lex Luthor says, what we call God depends upon our tribe, because God is tribal. God takes sides. No man in the sky intervene to deliver me from daddy's fists and abominations. If God is all powerful, he cannot be all good. And if he is all good, he cannot be all powerful. Now, Lex Luthor is no philosopher, right? But I think he's hit the nail on the head. He's hit the nail on the head with this. Lex Luthor's, according to this reading of Superman, this version of Superman, became evil. One of the reasons is because of his suffering at the hands of his abusive father. And then he's asking, where was God to stop my father from, abusing me? It must be then, according to Luthor's reasoning, that if this God was all powerful, he could have surely stopped my father from abusing me, but he didn't. So therefore, it must be that he's not all powerful. Now, in a nutshell, that is essentially the problem of evil within the Islamic, generally how it's framed within Islamic early texts, because it's related to divine power. So Lex Luthor was probably read some Kalam books. I don't know, maybe, right? But essentially the problem of evil is if we take some core attributes of the divine, so if he's all powerful, he knows everything, and he's perfectly good, then there shouldn't be evil in the world. There shouldn't be pain and suffering and hurt and anguish in the world. Why? Because God will have the power to be able to stop all evil. And he will have the knowledge to identify what is evil in order to then stop it. And if he is perfectly good, he'd want to stop all that evil. So clearly, these attributes and evil are incompatible. And that's the crux of the problem of evil. How the existence of evil, i.e. pain and suffering and bad states of affairs in the world, how that can exist and be compatible with a being who is all-powerful, knowing, and benevolent. And here are some books on theodicy. I'm not going to go through them, but one I will mention is a book there that you see there in red, Revival of Piety Through an Islamic Theodicy. This is by a good friend of mine, Dr. Talal Zaini, who's in the States. He published this book independently. This is why not many people know about it, but it's actually a 600, nearly 700-page book on theodicy. And to my knowledge, it's the largest book written on the topic. And I think it's worth people checking out the book. But all of them are good. So Tubanu's book, I'm sure many of you will know who she is as well. So those are some of the books, in case you're wondering what could be some textbooks to read in the field. Here are some. The family of theodicists are very, very small at the moment. Very, very small. Okay, I'm not going to go through epistemology, a detour. We'll leave that to later. But let me frame the problem of evil according to Hujjat al-Islam, and that will take us into essentially where we want to go. Now, with all things, perceptive and astute and inspirational, Imam al-Ghazali is just, you never find anything short of that. Everything he writes on just seems to be Allah's given him the gift where he just pinpoints things, and here is, I think he captures beautifully the problem of evil as we tend to define it in contemporary analytic philosophy of religion. And I'll mention why I'm focusing on the analytic philosophy of religion in just a second. Imam al-Ghazali says, rahimahullah, لعلك تقول ما معنى كونه تعالى رحيما وكونه أرحم الراحمين والرحيم لا يرى مبتلى ومضرورا ومعذبا ومريضا وهو يقضي على إماطة ما بهم إلا ويبادر إلى إماطته. So perhaps you will ask, he says, what's the meaning of Allah being the most compassionate and the most merciful? A compassionate person doesn't see someone being afflicted, injured, or tormented without rushing to remove that from him, if he is able to remove it. وَالرَّبُّ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى قَادِرٌ عَلَى كِفَايَةِ كُلِّ بَلِيَّةٍ وَدَفْعِ كُلِّ فَقْرٍ وَالْغَمَّ وَإِمَاتَةِ كُلِّ مَرَضٍ وَإِزَالَةِ كُلِّ ضَرَرٍ والدنيا طافحة بالأمراض والمحن والبلايا وهو قادر على إزالة جميعها وَتَارِكُ عِبَادِهِ مُمْتَحِنِينَ بِالرَّزَايَا وَالْمِحَنِ. Now Allah is able to ward off every misfortune and to prevent all poverty and grief and remove all sickness and every injury. But we see the world is full of sickness and tribulations and calamities. He, Jalla wa Ala, is able to remove all of them, and yet he leaves his servants in travail to disasters and misfortune. So here, linking Allah as being maximally compassionate and all-powerful, but yet he's left his servants in, distress, disaster, misfortune, and he can remove it just like that, but he doesn't. And perhaps people may ask why that is the case. That essentially is the problem of evil as it's understood pretty much in contemporary analytic philosophy of religion. Pretty much contemporary analytic philosophy of religion. So he's he has an immense foresight like that. Much of what he writes anyway would be very conducive to what analytic philosophers of religion, how they would frame things. Anyway, so in the literature, you'll find different types of problem of evil. We mentioned them at the beginning. You'll find the logical problem of evil, the evidential problem of evil, the experiential problem of evil, and what I've called the system problem of evil. So the logical problem of evil is what I mentioned at the beginning, that evil is logically incompatible with the divine attributes of power, knowledge, and goodness. The evidential problem of evil says God's existence is highly improbable given the amount of evil and suffering in the world. The experiential problem of evil says belief in God is extremely difficult given the types of pain and suffering people experience in the world, rape, torture, whatever it might be. And the system problem of evil is whether that's the natural system set up in the world, laws of nature and things like that, or as I talked about, regimes, whether human structures or human power, dynamics of power. So in the contemporary philosophy of religion literature, you'll find many people tackling the problem of evil with philosophical arguments. They want to try and use the tools of logic, the methods of precision in language, formal tools of analysis to try and answer the problem of evil in a theoretical way as a logical intellectual exercise. 90% of the literature you find, theodicy literature, is this type of analytic approach. You see a conundrum, evil, divine attributes, and you resolve it through a philosophical exercise. You show the logical compatibility and you present it with formal premises, and then you say, khalas, the problem of evil is solved. So once you show the logical compatibility between evil, the existence of evil and the divine attributes, you solve the problem of evil. But as we'll see, the compassionate theodicy that I want to look at is going to push back on this a bit. It's going to push back. Okay, so before we go on to compassionate theodicy, let's look at what theodicies are and what is an anti-theodicy. Because a compassionate theodicy that I'm going to look at is not an anti-theodicy. It's not an anti-theodicy. Okay, so within the literature, contemporary philosophy of religion literature, you find two terms being used: theodicy and defense. Now, what's the difference? Some people say this is a distinction without a difference. The difference is this, I think. So a theodicy is where you actually develop a reason or an argument to explain why Allah may allow, balaya, tribulations, suffering, pain, all these kind of things, i.e. an actual reason. You say Allah's reason for allowing this is this, and you state it as your argument. Whereas a defense is more cautious. A defense says, what could be a possible reason? It may not even be true. Just what is a possible reason that Allah may have that for why he would permit suffering and pain in the world? It may not be true. You may not even like it, but as long as it's compatible logically, and there's no, it doesn't undermine God in any way. So a defense is just a mere possible proposal, not an actual proposal. So that's the difference that most people give between a theodicy and a defense. Anyway, let's move on. So what are some of the solutions given by Muslim scholars over the centuries to try and deal with the problem of evil? Now, here are some. Some scholars said evil is just unavoidable. It's just a secondary occurrence. It may not be a primary occurrence, but it happens because something else happens. So if I use my free will, a secondary occurrence from my free will could be something bad can happen from my free will. So it's kind of a knock-on effect. Some scholars say evil is just nisbi or i'tibari. Evil is just what I think is evil. I look at something and it looks evil to me, therefore I give the hukum that it's evil. Or I look at something, I think it's good, I then give the hukum that it's good. And this is the subject matter of a tahseen or taqbih. When the aql says something is husn, is good, or qubh is bad. So some people say evil is just subjective. It's just based on your subjective assessment. Some of the ulama say actually evil in the end is actually a khair. It's actually a good. It's a disguised good. So like you take off the thawb of evil and underneath is good. Some of the scholars said, look, this is contrasted. The reason why we have evil is so we can appreciate good. The reason why we have poverty is we can appreciate wealth. The reason why we have sickness is so we can appreciate health. The reason why we have dhulm is so we can understand and appreciate and defend al-adl, justice. So this is how some people use theodicy. Like, in the Hanafi madhab, in the position of our school, one of the maqsad of jihad is izalatul dhulm. It's not izalatul kufr as well. For the Shafi'is, it's izalatul kufr. This is the illah of jihad. But for the Ahnaf, we say as well, izalatul dhulm is the aim of jihad. So we materially intervene to remove people from dhulm and oppression. So people then appreciate that when they see Islam implemented, they see the justice. You can see. So anyway, so theodicy is contrastive. So Allah's put negative in the world so we can appreciate the positive. Some people say, look, evil just is part of the furniture of the world. It's part of the reality. We just have to accept it. It's just the way the world is. Evil is a way to draw closer to Allah Azza wa Jal. Suffering and pain, if this classed as evil, it's a way to draw closer to Allah. So if someone is very ill, Allah wipes away the sins and brings them closer to Him. Some people like Imam al-Maturidi, rahimahullah, he says, tests and tribulations and difficulties is necessary for you to train your nafs to become the slave that Allah wants you to become. It's a nafs building. Some people say evil secures greater goods. And so the reason why Allah gives evil is because there is a greater benefit to be had. Some people say evil is part of the perfection of the world. So when Hujjat al-Islam says, "Laysa fil imkan abda'u mimma kan," when he said the world is perfect exactly the way it is, that means evil is part of the perfection of the world. The optimum nature of the world, the best possible world, includes evil. Some people say evil is educative. Through evil, Allah makes us aware of His attributes and things like that. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim talks about this a lot. All right, so those are some of the accounts of evil in the world, why there's evil in the world. Now on to anti-theodicies. Now, anti-theodicies, and this is going to link me into compassionate theodicy now. Anti-theodicy in the contemporary sense, before I go on to the Ash'ari and Zahiri sense, in the contemporary sense, anti-theodicy is the position that theodicies are harmful and dangerous. They are harmful and dangerous because they detach you from evil, because all you're doing is you're just erecting philosophical models and trying to work out what the answer is and whether it's logically compatible or not. So this is an abstract exercise, and evil, we should never approach evil in that way. It's not a mathematical problem like we sit from an armchair and try and solve. Theodicies desensitize those who give answers. So some people who always discuss theodicy and write about theodicy, they have no idea of the pain that people are suffering. They give you a syllogism and they say, khalas, that's it, that solves the problem of evil. I gave you a syllogism. I gave you a muqaddimat al-kubra, al-sughra, and a natija. What's your problem? So theodicies can be very insensitive. Someone's, I don't know, a close relative dies, and then someone comes along and says, oh, you know, in the Kalam books, we have like five explanations for the problem of evil. Maybe there's a greater good, you know, out of the four, maybe this one, there's a greater good, you know, and then you start talking about theodicy in a theologically philosophical sense. No, what's going on here, you know? Again, similarly, there's a moral blindness that these people say about theodicy. You're missing the point, the whole moral centeredness, the whole moral crux of it. Theodicies are very consequentialist. You're just looking at what is the outcome. You're trying to do a balancing act with theodicy. So the greater good is achieved through Allah allowing evil. So it's like a sums game, you know. Theodicies make people a means, not ends. So this is the idea of theodicies being instrumentalized accounts. Why are we using people as stepping stones? Why are we making people the stepping stone of pain and suffering for some greater good? Why are we using people as means to achieve a greater good? And this is known as the instrumental objection to theodicies. Some people say theodicies encourage political quietism. So if you think theodicies, if you think evil is part of God's creation, then it should be there. So then you don't want to change something. So if someone says to someone who's being abused, look, qada of Allah, Allah's qada, yani just have sabr. You're being beaten up, but just have sabr, and this is part of Allah's plan. Maybe, but how is that person who's suffering abuse? How are you going to change their situation? Similarly, when a regime is oppressing the people, are you going to just sit there and say, oh, this is part of the qada of Allah, like the Umayyads used, you know? And this is part of Allah's decree that we're like this. So ma'alish, you have to just accept us. The last view of anti-theodicy is actually you're contributing to more evil in the world by not stopping evil. By not stopping evil. Okay, now in the Ash'ari sense of anti-theodicy, I'm going in a longer roundabout way to get to compassionate theodicy, but it's very important to build the background theory before we look at what compassionate theodicy is. So the Imams, the A'imma of the Ash'ari school, rahimahumullah, they and others like the Zahiri school, they said that, look, why Allah does things, why he wills things, why he wants things to happen in the world, it's not our place. It's improper for us to try and find out the reasons, the motivations, the dafi' behind the divine actions. What you know, what's the cause behind the divine actions? You know, if Allah wanted to, he'll tell us why he does something. If he doesn't tell us, we just submit and we say, look, this is how Allah has decided it. He's willed it. Who are we? We're finite creatures. How can we understand the infinite mind? And then the other point is there's nothing to justify Allah's ways to human beings. Who are we? He is the sovereign. He created everything. Who are we to explain his actions and justify them? So Allah is not, he's not beholden to, he's not fixed by, he's not subject to a standard beyond himself, to us to judge that he's good or bad, or his actions are good or bad, or his choices are good or bad. He is not measured by any moral standard. His awamir is the standard. Allah's commands is the standard. So that's the other sense of anti-theodicy. Now, in a long roundabout way, getting to compassionate theodicy. So what is a compassionate theodicy? Right, so Bethany Soloredia has proposed a term called compassionate theodicy in a number of her writings. The most recent one was an article published in 2021, Compassionate Theodicy, a suggested truce between intellectual and practical theodicy. That's an article, and then her book here, Why Is There Suffering? This is one of her practical ways that she, that she proposes to adopt or put into practice compassionate theodicy. I think it's worth checking out. What is compassionate theodicy? She doesn't define it in this way. I've kind of, from her work, have just given a general definition of what I think captures most of the aspects of what it is. So a compassionate theodicy is a practical method of dealing with the problem of evil that involves giving back agency of decision-making to the sufferer by providing them with theodicy pathways or tracks, not definitive answers. Why? So that the person suffering can meaningfully reappraise their beliefs about God, the world, and suffering. Let's unpack that a bit. Now, as I mentioned, in current philosophical theology or philosophy of religion, and owing to, unfortunately, philosophers, who are operating in the field of Islamic studies, Muslim philosophers and theologians who have adopted analytic philosophy, much of the theodicy literature is not written for people who are suffering, who are personally suffering. It's not written for that purpose. It's not practical theology. These works, if you open up any works from the 60s until now in the philosophy of religion, it's all theoretical, logical, formal. You need a BA in logic to be able to read it, So these books aren't written for practical purposes. So therefore, the audience of people who are suffering, these works cannot relate to that, to the millions of people that are actually suffering. Philosophical works in theodicy are, what I think, response-focused and not patient-focused. So these philosophical works are concerned about imposing definitive answers instead of allowing the patient to make meaning out of suffering and pain. So that meaning-making construction, meaning-making construct. Thirdly, philosophical works on theodicy employ an alienating jargon. You open up these books, the logical, metaphysical, ethical terms that are used, that are far removed from any kind of spiritual, kind of psychological sort of significance with the patient. You can't use for any possible world W if S commits an act phi in world W. It just is no. This language is not going to work. The language of mathematical logic is not going to work. The language of analytic metaphysics is not going to work. So we need a different approach. And this is where compassionate theodicy comes in. But the aim of compassionate theodicy is not to sort of give graphic examples or illustrations or sort of hard-nosed answers. The purpose of compassionate theodicy is to help the sufferer tell their own story, to construct meaning out of their own case, so that they can then relate back to their Lord and make meaning out of that relationship with their Lord and that understanding of why they're suffering. So they got to take the initiative is going to be put back on the patient who's suffering. The method of compassionate theodicy is to draw on, kind of therapeutic sort of maneuvers. So the patient can do what we call a reappraisal, to shift how they're looking at things in a way that's meaningful to them based on categories of their own belief. So for a Muslim who's suffering pain and inestimable suffering, horrendous evils, the method for them would be to bring the solution bring the task onto themselves and try reappraise and make meaning for themselves through the categories of their aqidah and their belief, through the terms, ideas, precepts, notions, concepts from their aqidah, from their worldview, from their religious outlook. Finally, what would the compassionate theodicy try and achieve? Well, the theodicist in this case, the one who's providing the theodicy, is there like a coach or a guide. They're there to help facilitate the patient to construct meaning from their suffering. And all the theodicist is doing is taking them through a pathway, a theodicy pathway or tract. So the theodicist would offer several ways or tracts or pathways to look at that could help them to look at the problem of evil or to look at their pain and suffering and say, look, here are possible considerations for you to explore. And then we'll give a language that is more in tune with tarbiyah, is more in tune with, the psychological disposition, is more in tune with the nafsiyah, rather than the analytic sort of nomenclature and jargon. So finally, what would the Muslim theodicist do? The Muslim theodicist will assume the role of a humble coach and guide. And here Islamic pastoral theology, Islamic shepherding comes into place. And there's lots of great work being done on this. The Muslim theodicist would adopt accessible framework and terms and ideas and concepts from the tradition. And here I think hadith works become very, very important, especially Tasliyat al-Musab, the Tasliyat al-Musab literature. So our ulama, so like Imam Ali al-Qari, Imam Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, many people wrote Tasliya books, like how to comfort people and console them. Like if you lose your eyesight, you become blind, or you lose your health, or you lose a loved one. The ulama collected hadith to try and console you, to make you feel better. This is the kind of approach I think that we need to think about more. And I'll be presenting a paper in Qatar in October, inshallah, on this very idea of Tasliya within theodicy paradigm.
Sorry, Saf,
yeah.
Do you mean teselli or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The idea is tasalli as well, exactly, the same term.
Seleye was the root?
Yes, that's right. Saleh is a root, that's right. So we have it in Urdu as well. I'm sure it may be in Turkish as well. We have tasalli, which is to make someone comfort them, to make them feel better, to relieve their pain. Finally, the theodicist, the Muslim theodicist who's compassionate, should allow the suffering believer to undertake the reappraisal or meaning-making process rather than impose solutions on them. So I guess in a roundabout way, the compassionate theodicy is not really anything new, but it's a renewal of this type of approach where we move away from philosophical, steely, sort of formal, abstract philosophical arguments that think they've solved the problem of evil just because they've showed the logical compatibility, the formal compatibility between evil and the divine attributes. But that logical argument doesn't ameliorate the suffering a personal individual faces. Now, the compassionate theodicy, I must add before I close, doesn't reject the theoretical component. It doesn't reject the intellectual aspect, the logical, formal stuff. We need that to understand and formally construct what the problem is. But the approach is more bring it onto the patient, let the patient understand from their own value categories, their own ethical categories, from their own worldview, and make meaning from their suffering. So I'll end it there, and sorry for maybe going over time.